and I believe we're live. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session panel entitled China's Role in Shaping International Economic Governance, New Models and Implications for Trading Partners. My name is Locknie Su. I am very honored to be the moderator for this panel with very interesting speakers on this important topic. I just wanted to also thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to learn from all the colleagues here. Now, we have 4 speakers here, and the format of the discussion will be as follows. We will have, in order of logical sequence, not what you see in your schedule. First, Professor Markus Wagner. Then we will have Dr. Elizabeth Sheargold. We have Dr. Manu Misra, and finally, Professor Heng Wang. The reason for that order is because we will go from the broad governance issues to the examples of trading partners, Australia and Brazil, which will be handled by Dr. Sheargold and Dr. Misra. And finally, Professor Heng Wang will give us the observations as to China's approach in international economic governance by making a few comparisons. So let me just also let everyone know that the public chat is available. If you have a question for any of the panelists at any point, please do type in your question. I would encourage you to type a question succinctly and clearly so that we can get the panelists to answer the questions and be able to understand what the question is about. So just very briefly, the panel is not about me, it's about the speakers, but I just want to give a point of reference. Why China? I'm not in the organizing committee, but in its wisdom, the organizers has chosen this topic. I'm guessing China has been in the World Trade Organization for roughly 2 decades now. It has representation in many international bodies and organizations. China has led its own initiatives and activities relating to trade and investment, for example, the Belt and Road Initiative. It's also a member of the BRICS group, and it has participated in numerous FTAs and international investment agreements. One of the most recently concluded ones that China has participated in is called the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, which is between ASEAN and 5 of its trade partners. So what we're looking for in this session really is, with all this activity with China participating in different fora, are there new models or are there patterns and trends which are emerging that we can observe, whether they're dealing with existing legal issues or newer issues like in the digital economy realm? So what are some of the implications then from these observations from our panelists for trade partners? So let me just very quickly introduce our first speaker, Professor Markus Wagner. He's admirably been also on the organizing committee, running through the logistics and the organizational aspects, and also now going to contribute as a panelist. I take my hat off to you, Markus. And Markus is Associate Professor of Law at University of Wollongong and Director of its Transnational Law and Policy Center. Expertise is in international economic law and governance, public international law, and comparative constitutional law. I could go on for every speaker, but I just need to highlight some of the choice bits from the bio so that you have an idea what Markus is looking at. So Markus will kick us off with the topic on general international governance, and then we will see if there are any questions in the meantime after he speaks before we move on to the next panelist. Markus, please.
Thanks so much, Locknie, and thanks for these kind words of introduction. So what I'm presenting today is off of a paper draft that I'm working on at the moment called The Evolving Landscape of International Economic Governance Models. And what I want to do today, because we decided we'd provide sort of limited time to everyone, is present a model for determining the characteristics of international economic governance in the 21st century outside of the EU, and I'll get to that in a second. The EU is really singular in its substance and its process and its forthcoming, and the usual way of thinking about integration in almost always based on the EU isn't particularly useful, right? We sort of see preferential trade agreements, free trade agreements, customs unions, common or single market mechanisms, single currency schemes, common passport areas, fiscal unions, political unions, yada, yada, yada. I don't find that to be particularly useful. And so what I thought of doing was, can we find a different model of international economic governance? And can we find elements which are representative of different models, right? And really are part of almost all the models that we have seen traditionally, at least. So what I'm looking at then is substantive coverage, and I'll go into each one of these in a second. The degree of regulatory coherence between the members, certain institutional mechanisms, the use of international standards, as well as the type of dispute settlement mechanisms that's being used. And in the paper, I go through three what I call arrangements, namely the CPTPP, the RCEP, and the Belt and Road Initiative. And I'm happy to go into details as to why I think these three are comparable in the Q&A, because I've received some feedback on that in a prior conversation about this. And so what I want to do today really is introduce a very much abbreviated version of the model that I'm proposing and more details about that, and then show how it applies in the context of the CPTPP, the RCEP, and the BRI. So let me just run through these five elements of the model. Namely, the first one is subject matter coverage. The traditional issues are goods, services, IP. What we see recently is a significant expansion of this. Substantively, for example, we see e-commerce, digital trade more generally. Procedurally, we see something like regulatory coherence. We also see a whole range of institutional innovations. And in the paper, I go through this in much greater detail. The second part that I think is paradigmatic here is regulatory coherence. So we move away from tariff to non-tariff barriers, and then regulatory coherence is this next step in the process towards greater integration, and really addressing the alignment of procedural requirements that may lead to a de facto behind-the-border barrier to international trade. So why is this important? Regulatory coherence really attempts to eliminate regulatory barriers. It's intended to lead to greater compatibility between the regulatory systems of the members, and it's designed to increase transparency in governmental decision-making. So we see, for example, transparency, public consultation elements in these agreements, regulatory impact analysis, and very much a coordination among different actors involved in regulating. The third and very much related part to this is what I would call institutional arrangements for regulatory cooperation. And this is exchange of information of new or existing governmental measures, notifications, harmonization efforts, policy coordination, and I think importantly also preemption of disputes from entering the litigation phase. And we see this in new agreements that go considerably further, very much different from qualitatively from previous arrangements. The now comatose Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership is a pretty good example, I think. It had a horizontal regulatory coherence chapter, and making therefore the TTIP a living instrument, right? So regulators would meet quite often, and we see this in some of the agreements that
I'm sorry, Markus. There are some people who are typing into the chat box that they can't hear you. I'm not sure why.
That would not be good.
I'm sorry to stop you, but I thought you should know.
Yes, that would be. Thanks. Can you
some people say yes, now they can hear. Is anyone else having an issue hearing Markus? They can hear me, but not you, apparently.
Then why don't we try Manu and Liz to go first?
Sure thing. Yeah, sorry everyone. While Markus is checking what the issue is, can you hear me? Can someone just give me a signal? Can you hear me though? Yes, great. Thank you very much. Okay, so change of plan. We're going to move on to our second and third speakers first. While we wait for Markus to come back on in a moment, Dr. Elizabeth Sheargold is a Vice Chancellor's Postdoctoral Research Fellow at the University of Wollongong, and she's held a range of academic positions, and I won't read out her whole bio, which is very impressive. She has been in private practice in a private firm. She has also been an advisor in the Iran-US Claims Tribunal. And following Liz will be co-presenting rather with Liz is Dr. Manu Misra. Dr. Misra is a global fellow at the FGV, Getulio Vargas, I hope I pronounced that right, Foundation School of Law in Sao Paulo. So he's joining us at 6 a.m. or so in Brazil. So thank you very much, Manu. He received his PhD from Bocconi University, Milan, and holds an LLM in Law and Economics from University of Hamburg. So the topic that Liz and Manu are going to share with us on is China's measures on trade and investment impacts on selected agriculture and mining sectors in Australia and Brazil. So it talks about two specific trade partners in line with the theme of this panel, Australia and Brazil, and what their observations might be in their research. Please, Liz, I believe you're starting. Go ahead.
Thanks very much, Locknie. I just want to start by checking, can everyone hear me? If someone could just reply in the chat to say that Heng can hear me, that's positive. Yes, great, people can hear. Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much, Locknie, for the kind introduction, and thank you to the SIEL Organising Committee for having us here today. It's unfortunate that Markus is not present for my thanking of him and the committee, but anyway. The work that Manu and I are presenting today is drawn from a larger cooperative research project between the University of Wollongong and FGV Sao Paulo, which is funded by FAPESP and UAW, and Markus is also involved in that, along with Michele Raton Sanchez Badin, who I think from the chat has also gotten up very early to be with us today. So well, hi, Michele, and thank you for that. What we're looking at in this wider project is essentially considering China's rise in economic power from the point of view of its trading partners. Specifically, we're looking at China's use of non-tariff barriers and trade remedies in relation to commodities exports from markets like Australia and Brazil. What specifically Manu and I will be covering today is we're going to start off with a brief introduction to the legal and diplomatic architecture of relations between each of Australia and China, and then Manu will talk about Brazil and China. Then we're going to look at recent political tensions and disruptions that have arisen in these relationships and trade measures that China has enacted in response to that, and the form of those measures. And then we'll offer some conclusions and inferences about the forms of economic action or economic coercion that China has been engaging in relation to these two countries. So to start off with, there's obviously a lot that is similar and different about Australia and Brazil's relations with China. The similarity that this project focuses on is in the actual goods that are traded and the nature of the trading relationship. So for both Australia and Brazil, China is the most significant export partner. However, obviously neither Australia or Brazil are China's most significant trading partner. In addition, we trade quite similar, we have quite similar profiles for what is traded between these nations. So in both cases, it's mining and agricultural products that are the chief traded products. So they're asymmetrical trading relationships of similar kinds of goods. Of course, there are then very important differences in terms of history, cultural dynamics and political dynamics that exist when you compare Australia and Brazil in relation to China. So to start with Australia, obviously Australia is regionally close to China, but it's had a more complex political relationship than Brazil. So as Manu will talk about, there's the sort of South-South cooperative nature of the Brazil-China relationship. They're both BRICS nations, whereas Australia and China have had a somewhat different dynamic. And it's a trading relationship that's evolved considerably since the 1970s, but the pinnacle of the actual architecture of the relationship now is an FTA that came into force in 2015. So that's with sort of a hard law rules-based approach to bilateral trading relations, which reflects Australia's general approach to bilateral trade relations. Australia has many FTAs, particularly with its partners and neighbours in the Asia-Pacific region. And the FTA between Australia and China has a few interesting features. One that's most relevant for our presentation today is that one of the major concessions Australia won under that FTA was to get a lot of agricultural tariffs reduced or removed. That was one of the major wins that Australia saw under that FTA, which is then obviously very relevant to the kind of measures that China has applied later. But I'll now pass to Manu to discuss the Brazilian relationship.
Morning, everyone. Just want to check if everyone can hear me, if that's all right, and see me as well, for that matter. Great, okay. Thank you for the introduction, Locknie. Thanks, Liz, for introducing. I think I'll just get right into it. So when we usually speak of Brazil in the context of international economic law, we discuss it as a counter-argument against the sort of dubious relationship between BITs and FCI. But here in the context of this economic relation with China, I think there's a similarity, as Liz hinted at, in the starting point. The the economic relationship between Brazil and China versus Australia and China, in that they are major commodity exporters. But I mean, there's not a whole lot common in other spheres. So if I look at the nature of the diplomatic relationship, as Liz mentioned, there's been an emphasis on forging a long-term strategic partnership, South-South cooperation, and in many ways, I mean, China's rise has been a welcome proposition here in Brazil, particularly given its location and well, from the strategic community in Brazil, given the Monroe Doctrine, given the position of the United States, and sort of not being in favor of any peer competitor in the region. I think China's rise has been a welcome proposition for Brazil. And I think that reflects in the legal architecture between the two countries and how the economic relations governed. There is no, compared to Australia, there's no PTAs or FTAs, there's no BIT between Brazil and China. But however, there's a rather sophisticated and complex nature of a set of MOUs, protocols, soft law instruments, which it would be a mistake to sort of consider as being inconsequential. I mean, they've been of rather great consequence. They focus on facilitation, on dispute prevention. There's a binational committee which acts as a key sort of coordinating vehicle between the two countries. There's a focus on promotion, on cooperation, and that's been the case out of mutual preference. Both Brazil and China have been were keen on taking that path forward in developing the economic relationship. It's also important, I suppose, to mention that domestic politics in Brazil compared to Australia has been slightly different, and that's also relevant to the nature in which their relationship, the economic relationship, has sort of progressed. Domestic politics here in Brazil, it's much more fragmented, it's much more polarized. There are multiple large lobbies here. Brazil and China has been a very partisan topic here in Brazil. It's worth mentioning. And you know, if you consider the position in sort of more Western countries and in Europe and Australia, in fact, there's been a bipartisan consensus growing in these countries about certain aspects of their China policy. And if at all there is a bipartisan consensus in Brazil, it's actually in favor of policy measures such as inclusion of Huawei in Brazil's 5G networks, or being not being in favor of investment screening, that sort of thing, which is counterintuitive if you compare to Australia or to the EU. And there's been a very active para-diplomacy taking place, unlike, say, in Australia, where that was an issue for the federal government. Back to you, Liz.
Thanks, Manu. So even though there are these two very different sorts of legal architectures and sort of diplomatic styles in the two relationships, what we're now going to discuss are some recent tensions that have arisen in each relationship and trade measures that China has taken in response to those. Now, when this project first started in 2019, we were thinking, oh, there's a few trade barriers that have come up. In relation to Australia and China, as I'm sure many of the audience know, that the trade tensions have really peaked in the last 2 years, and there has now been a barrage of both tensions and responsive measures. So I'm not going to go through all of those measures in detail. I just want to flag a few of the key points. So China last year leaked to the Australian media a list of 14 grievances that it had with various aspects of Australia's economic policy and some political aspects as well. Some of the key issues that China has highlighted were things like Huawei and ZTE being excluded from the 5G build-out in Australia, various decisions by our Foreign Investment Review Board to reject Chinese efforts to invest or purchase assets in infrastructure and agriculture in Australia, various anti-dumping measures imposed by Australia, and Australia's call for an investigation into the origins of the COVID-19 outbreak, which was seen as Australia effectively acting as a proxy for the United States. These are among many other issues that have created some tension in the Australia-China relationship in recent years. These tensions have now led to various trade measures being imposed by China against Australia. Just yesterday, it was published that a Chinese official described this as punishment for Australia and actually used that language. And there's been a number of different measures. I'm going to group them into two categories for the purpose of this presentation. The first are the imposition of anti-dumping and countervailing duties as sort of more formal and longer-term measures. So this has happened in two cases, first in relation to barley and then wine. Both of these are now being challenged by Australia in the WTO. In both cases, the duties are to be imposed for 5 years. For barley, the total duties are about 80%. And for wine, they vary between 115 and 215%. So they're quite significant duties that are being imposed there. And then the second category of measures are more informal and short-term measures that are done through things like import licensing requirements, increased customs inspection, and temporary bans on specific entities exporting to China on the basis of health and safety concerns. So these have arisen in a number of agricultural sectors as well as in relation to coal. So we've seen a certain beef abattoir from Queensland be denied the right to export to China on the basis of a finding of antibiotics in a sample. The beef exporter in question says it was a false positive. There are numerous other negatives, but the Chinese authorities had banned that particular abattoir. Similar things were done in relation to timber, some grain suppliers, live lobsters. There were trace metals found, and then also cotton exports. So there's been a range of agricultural exports. And we've also seen coal exports in 2019 and 2020 slowed down by import licensing requirements and increased customs procedures. And these measures have been taken by China. Many of them are in sectors that have particularly, that Australia had won particular concessions under the FTA. So beef, wine, these were areas in which Australia had gotten China to agree to reduce or remove its tariffs. Those were considered very significant wins for the Australian agricultural sectors involved. And we see it's those sectors that have been targeted with some of these measures. Sorry, back to Manu.
Right, okay, so I just wanted to emphasize from what I mentioned before. So I mean, it's important to keep in mind that both Brazil and China view each other very differently as compared to how China and Australia view each other. And that also reflects in the economic relationship. Now, I would frame this part of our discussion slightly differently. So, I mean, before I get into the sort of main argument, I should mention that up till 2018, the general elections held in Brazil and the election of President Bolsonaro, there had already been some slight dissatisfaction with the way in which the economies or Chinese economic relations had landed, so to speak, in Brazil. I mean, there was slight dissatisfaction at the fact that there was more large brownfield investments, more sort of strategically placed investments that Brazilian firms were not able to sort of move up the value chain, and there was sort of more extractive commodities being emphasized on, and not much tech transfer happening back to Brazil. There was some environmental concerns with the Amazon, etc. And so that's a sort of background we have. There's also concern about sort of the asymmetry between the two countries is sort of widening, and that's still the case. And I think what's important now in the argument we have at the moment is that, you know, China up to 2020 or 2021 is now sees itself and is by many means a great power, and great powers wield, in terms of economic diplomacy, sticks and carrots in terms of how it deals with middle powers or smaller economies. And we've seen that even in the case of Brazil, despite the sort of notion of strategic partnership, South-South cooperation. And that's more reflective of just how great powers act. It's not necessarily simply a China question. It's just how the nature of great powers' behavior. So 2019, we saw in this sort of analogy, we see a couple of large carrots being presented to President Bolsonaro on his visit to China. And so, I mean, there were many investments prior to that, and sort of many other economic incentives to, you know, have a deeper economic relationship with China. But I mean, so at that point, it took the headlines. It was $100 billion US dollars announced for infrastructure investments. There was Huawei projects. There was quite prominent Chinese participation in the oil auction in 2019 as well. And that seemed to work. I mean, it seemed to sort of turn the approach of the Bolsonaro administration in favor of China. He made positive statements about Huawei's involvement, about their economic relation with China, and things seemed quite fine until the Trump administration got serious about taking a hard stance on Huawei, and the pandemic happened, and the Bolsonaro administration and his sort of ideological wing of the Brazilian government, the federal executive, took sort of very abrasive, undiplomatic, and sort of rhetoric was applied primarily through social media and things of the kind. And that followed then with sticks in terms of economic diplomacy, where we saw, just like in Australia's case, poultry and pork imports were the case for Brazil. But I would say, I mean, I'd be very careful here in sort of terming this. In the Australian case, it was mentioned as literally the word punishment was used. I don't think that was the case. That would be the appropriate word in the Brazilian context. It's more of a warning shot, right? So it was very controlled, very specific. It was for about 3 or 4 months, and I don't think that would be the sort of approach. I think so. The Chinese government has been actually very restrained and controlled in its approach of geoeconomics or economic diplomacy towards Brazil because of how it views Brazil as a long-term strategic partner, and has more to gain, I suppose, in many ways here because of Brazil's large market, commodity resources, its geography, etc. And the second one, if I may just mention, I think it's not a commodity as such, but I mean, there has been an issue with the importation of raw materials for production of vaccines here in Brazil. And there was a delay in the import, and that has been widely attributed to the participation of Huawei in Brazil's 5G networks. Again, it's a bit complex there, so it's not quite as straightforward as saying that the supply of vaccine raw materials was weaponized. I mean, there has been a sort of a bargaining trip sort of deal there as well, but we've seen in other countries as well that the exclusion of Huawei from 5G networks has led to trade coercion from the Chinese government, and that's well established in other countries, even for a small country like the Faroe Islands near Denmark. So that's been the case. Brazil has been no exception to that, and so I suppose the point to be taken is that the China of today is a risen great power, and great powers employ sticks and carrots. Strategic partners, South-South cooperation being no exception to that rule. Here's back to you.
So I know that Locknie wants us to wrap up soon, so we'll make this fairly brief, but we just wanted to identify a few of the patterns and kind of inferences that come up from comparing the two case studies. So the first thing is that the trade measures that China has taken in relation to each of Australia and Brazil, we see two key similarities. One is the very efficient and strategic selection of the sectors targeted. So in each case, they're not necessarily targeting the top commodities exports. Would often have an economic impact on China itself. For example, for Australia, iron ore is our top export, and China probably doesn't have an alternative source for the level of iron ore it purchases from Australia. But also, they've still selected sectors that are important and that are domestically, politically influential in each country. So in Australia, targeting key agricultural sectors, and in Brazil, targeting some key industries in relation to poultry and pork that are likely to have some political influence domestically. The second key similarity we see is objective justifications being offered for these measures. The Australian media likes to use the term plausible deniability, often in relation to public health and safety. So as Manu pointed out, the poultry and pork measures taken in relation to Brazil were justified on the basis of traces of COVID-19. Similar health and safety concerns were identified in relation to the short-term measures taken on Australian beef, timber, lobster, and some of the other Australian agricultural exports. And what we see is these similarities have arisen and similar measures have been taken in each case. As Manu says, there are still important differences and very important differences of scale. Certainly, there are more trade measures being imposed on Australia at the moment than there are in relation to Brazil. But we've seen the similarities despite the very different legal architectures and the different diplomatic relationships that the two nations have with China. And now back to Manu for one final word, I think.
Yeah, I think one inference or question rather that should be put forward is there an inherent hierarchy in economic relations with China? Is there, if China is a great power, it has risen to that status, there's a certain sensitivity that comes with it on certain specific issues, and so the question then is, is there a line that is to be followed, and is the line extra legal and therefore sort of enforced one way by means of power on the Chinese end. And where is that line? How soft or malleable it is, and how large will be the stick to enforce violations of that line depends. I think for Brazil, they've been patient, they've been more restrained as compared to some other countries, and that's partly because of, as I said before, they have more to gain from Brazil. But that's still a question. I would also point out that perhaps there's also a systemic issue there. I mean, the term systemic rivalry has been adopted by the European Union, and we've seen from the 14 points given to Australia that there is a dimension there which is problematic for liberal democracy. So there's also a systemic issue there, which I think countries should be wary of. Thanks.
Thank you very much for keeping to the time and for jumping in. We're very happy that Markus is back. Markus, do you just want to test your sound very quickly before we get to you?
Ask you whether the audience can hear me, and if anyone
Yes.
in the audience can actually just...
Is there anyone who could indicate, please? Wonderful. I think you're back. Okay, we'll get to you in a moment, Markus. But just as a quick follow-up, because of the presentation that the presentations, excuse me, that have just been heard from Liz and Manu, very interesting. Two quite far away places, and yet there's some kind of pattern that you're suggesting is emerging in terms of what Manu called economic diplomacy, carrots and sticks, and actions rather than agreements, because one country has an FTA, one does not with China. So I guess there's a question in the box, which I saw a moment ago, if I can find it. Is it a question of retaliation? I can't find it now, but if you can see it, Liz and Manu, do you want to pick up on that very quickly, just so that we have it fresh on our minds, your presentations? Do you see the question? I think it's from Ms. Marcia Harpaz. Is that how you pronounce it? Is the difference a matter of retaliation? Would either of you like to jump in and just quickly address that?
The scale of the measures that Australia is currently experiencing it does feel like there is an element of retaliation. I mean, as I mentioned, China had steered very clear, I think, of using directly terms like retaliation or punishment, but it was reported yesterday a Chinese official did actually use the term punishment to describe what was going on. I'm not passing any judgment on whether or not that's warranted. As I mentioned, there were various Australian measures, including economic measures like anti-dumping duties and foreign investment screening, that are some of the concerns China has raised. But I do think the extent of the tensions between Australia and China are currently much higher than the tensions between China and Brazil, at least is my understanding, and the extent of the trade measures Australia is experiencing reflects that. Manu, I don't know if you also want to make...
No, I would agree. I think it's very different. I think the way Chinese government views Brazil is, as I said, it's very different from Australia. Australia is involved in other issues, let's say in the South China Sea, as a member of the Quad, other things. It's been a strategic ally of the United States, and so there's an incentive of punishing that behavior as well, because of China status as at least a regional hegemon, which is not the case, which applies in Brazil's case. So there's definitely a distinction being made there. And in terms of retaliation, if you look at the nature of the messages of the president and his followers, not by the way, it's important to mention that not all of the federal executive, certain of the opposition, not from researchers, not from, as in the European Union's case. No, it's been just the federal executive's specific members who put out sort of a very abrasive rhetoric against the Chinese government. And so it's certainly a retaliation for that. It didn't escalate to anything further, so it's difficult to say. Huawei is a line, certainly. It's been the case in many other countries as well. And so, and it has to be mentioned, Brazil is the world's largest 5G spectrum auction. So it's a big chunk of the pie, which has been, as you've seen, after the bans in Europe, in India, in other parts of the world, it's been shortening and sort of decreasing in size for China. So I'm not at all surprised that there was a line not to be crossed.
I hope that answers the question in the box. If of course offline people want to contact, I guess Liz and Manu would be available if you want to share your email at the end of it. I think if there are follow-up questions, that's something that we can think about. But thank you very much. Just one very quick point before we get to Markus. I just wanted to ask, are there any particular lessons, I think, from your perspectives, since you've focused on the mining and agricultural sectors, are there particular lessons for other trading partners? Or is it dependent at the moment at the specific on the specific relationship that China has with Australia, China has with Brazil? Or is there something further that we can glean from what you've discussed very usefully for us? Singapore doesn't have mining or agriculture, so we're out of that game. But lots of other countries would be very interested in what you just said. So anything that you think could be extrapolated or shared or observed beyond Australia and Brazil in the mining and agricultural sectors? Thank you.
I think we could see similar measures taken against other countries. I think that there's no reason it couldn't happen in relation to other goods and commodities outside of those two sectors. Although I would say, I think there's specific aspects of agricultural trade that lend itself to the kind of measures that China's been engaging in. So in particular, the measures that have been imposed on some beef exporters from Australia, grain exporters in Queensland, that were very targeted at individual entities on the basis of health and safety concerns. So tests coming up showing beetles in a timber shipment, or weed seeds in a grain shipment, or metal traces in a lobster shipment. Those kind of measures, firstly, obviously much more likely to come up in relation to agriculture, those kind of biosecurity or SPS findings. Very hard to challenge, because it's essentially challenging a question of fact as to whether or not there was an actual issue with the shipments. And they can be imposed in a short-term way, and China can also then back down or release those measures without being seen to back down. So often they're only imposed for a few months, lightened up, they can be brought back in a year or two later. They don't have the sort of formal and long-term implications that something like anti-dumping duties or countervailing duties have. And I think those aspects are quite specific to the agricultural sector, those kind of biosecurity measures, and also the SPS obligations that are some of the more deferential obligations we typically find in the WTO agreements. And generally, as far as I understand it, China's FTAs don't go beyond the WTO agreement in substantive SPS obligations.
Thank you. Okay, we can take questions later on as well from Liz and Manu. Thank you very much. And I think right now we want to go back to Markus. Markus, you had a slide, I believe, and you want to pick up where you left off, please.
Thanks, Locknie, and my apologies for this. Wearing too many hats, I think, at this point is coming back to haunt me. So what I was saying for about 2 minutes, apparently, was that that this paper, or the presentation, is based on a paper that I'm working on at the moment that is called The Evolving Landscape of International Economic Governance Models. And in it, I wanted to present a model for determining the characteristics of international economic governance in the 21st century, and really outside of the EU context. I'm not going to go into that very much for the time being. But the EU is a sui generis organization from my perspective. And instead of looking at sort of the notion of preferential trade agreements, free trade agreements, customs unions, this progression that we see there, I propose to look at a number of elements that I think are characteristic for trade agreements or trade arrangements, a broader term, in the future and outside of the EU, like I said. The first one is substantive coverage. I'll get into all of these. The degree of regulatory coherence we see between the treaty parties or the members of the arrangements. Institutional mechanisms, the use of international standards, and the type of dispute settlement mechanisms that's being used. And then what I do is I apply that model to the CPTPP, the RCEP, and the Belt and Road Initiative, because I think, and I can go into why I choose these three. There seem to be some questions about whether you can compare the BRI to the CPTPP and RCEP, but I think you can. I'll go into that if questions come up. So let me go through the bits of the model. Subject matter coverage, the traditional issues we're all familiar with, the services, goods, services, and IP. We see significant expansion as of late. E-commerce, digital trade more generally. Procedurally, we see regulatory coherence coming to the fore. And institutionally, we see a whole range of innovations there that I go through in quite some detail in the paper. When we come to regulatory coherence, which is the second element that I identify in the model, is sort of we move from tariffs in the past to non-tariff barriers, and now we see the next step in this process towards greater integration is whether to align procedural requirements that may prevent de facto behind the border barriers to international trade. Why is regulatory coherence important? It attempts to eliminate these regulatory barriers. It's intended to lead to greater compatibility of regulatory systems, and it's really designed to increase transparency in governmental decision-making. So the most common elements that most of you are familiar with most likely are transparency, public consultations, regulatory impact analysis, and really coordination among different actors involved in regulation in member countries. Closely related to this is institutional arrangements that buttress this regulatory cooperation. Anne-Marie Slaughter has written about this, and others have written about this quite some time ago. It's really about exchange of information, notifications, harmonization efforts, mutual recognition at the very least, policy coordination, and to my mind, also importantly, the preemption of disputes from entering the litigation phase. And the newer PTAs go considerably further in this respect. We now see models that are now comatose, if you will, in the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. But I think importantly, there you saw something like the horizontal regulatory coherence chapter, which makes this was supposed to make the TTIP a living instrument, because that institution that buttressed the regulatory coherence was going to meet constantly, right? And Anne-Marie Slaughter, I think, put that quite well. The concerns, of course, are that that has the potential to curtail regulatory autonomy. Power disparity is clearly a problem, and those mechanisms often lack transparency in and of themselves. Again, happy to go into further details later on. Then the use or development of international standards. And as we all know, they play an important role in international trade and in international trade governance. And there's really two sides to this. Number one, they allow for easier circulation of products within countries that adhere to a particular standards, but they also prevent products that don't meet those requirements from entering the market and become competitors. And we know from, say, Article 3.3 of the SPS agreement that standards are not de jure binding, but they become de facto, nevertheless, binding, if you will, because conformity with the standard implies compliance, as Article 3.3 SPS agreement very clearly states. And the Brussels effect is important here because this bindingness is almost sort of certainly de facto true for non-parties if they want to export into particular countries. And you see this also in newer trade agreements, oftentimes, at least for some, with respect to environmental and labor standards. And finally, I go through what I would call three different types of dispute settlement mechanisms that we see. The first one is basically no dispute settlement mechanism, negotiated political consensus, or political dispute settlement, referral to adjudicator subject to veto by a party. The second one is a quasi-judicial model that consists of dispute settlement mechanisms that provides an automatic right to adjudication, but an independent party, but mostly ad hoc. And the third one is really a quasi-judicial model and differs in the degree of independence and the permanency of the membership of the dispute settlement organ. So if you then apply this model to, like I said, the CPTPP and the RCEP and the BRI, and now I'm hoping that the sharing of my screen works at least, then you get to something like this. You can see here on the left-hand side, CPTPP, RCEP, and the BRI. And so I've gone through the two agreements and what I would call the BRI as a larger arrangement, and somewhat tongue-in-cheek, I think you come out with this. And I'll keep this relatively brief. But the BRI is really an ill fit with existing agreements. And clearly, some people will now say, well, the BRI is only for outward or outbound investment arrangements. I don't think that's actually true if you go into some of the BRI documents. And the problem, of course, is getting a hold of them. And since I don't speak Mandarin, that sometimes has become an issue. But what we see is that the CPTPP differs from the RCEP. And the only element really in which the BRI has any salience or valence rather is on the standard side, with an asterisk there because the standards are very much Chinese standards, right? And there's reasons for this, namely that the BRI very much centers around China only with little chances for other governments to make an imprint on the structural design of the arrangement. As one author said, I think memorably, China sets up the room the framework, while all its partners may be invited to work together to design the interior details, but really not more than that. And from my perspective, at least, the BRI has created the de facto rather than the de jure economic integration mechanism on China's terms. That may initially appear innocuous, right? With few legal obligations in between. But it's worth pointing out that the BRI is at odds with the call for a rules-based system on the global level. And it's really designed in a manner that China's financial, economic, and political interests prevail in situations of serious disagreement. Let me close with this. There's separate different futures of international economic governance that I think can be drawn from this. If you look at the EU and the BRI, they're polar opposites. They only share one thing, really. They're a genus of one. We see a whole range of tensions between these different models. In the BRI, the US has clearly been critical. The EU has now characterized China as a systemic rival. And clearly, all governance models have political implication. The US was open about this as it was negotiating the TPP at the time. Similarly, the TTIP was a counterpoint to China. And I think what we see is competition for the rulemaking initiative in international economic relations. And each of the major players brewing their own elixir, right? Competition, the second thing we see from that is a competition for standard setting for 21st century international economic governance. And I think that's true even more so in today's world, where the visions for international economic governance are drifting further and further apart. And Liz has just alluded to this in the Australian context, and I'd be happy to chime in on that. And so we see uncertain and unsettled futures over the shaping of globalization and economic integration. I think we've sort of escaped in our field the jockeying for strategic competition for at least some time with the creation of the WTO. But the global and multilateral institutions appear to have been replaced, at least for now, with arrangements of a preferential nature. And the question that I think that raises is what kind of values, either explicit or implicit, these different arrangements carry with them. So let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Markus, for keeping to the time. We have a couple of quick questions based on your presentation. While it's fresh in everyone's minds, maybe we can go to that from Masha again. If you can see it, Markus. The first one is a comment. Not sure we can even put BRI into category of PTA, Preferential Trade Agreement. And secondly, so is BRI direction China is going in international trade governance. So do you want to take the second?
Yeah, sure. So let me shelve the first one, Marcia. I'm happy to engage with you one-on-one on this wonderful platform if you want. But let me take the second one. And Locknie, I think we've talked about this as well beforehand, right? So yes, there are preferential trade agreements that China is engaging in, right? But I don't think that's, and Heng can either correct me, but I think he'll probably agree with me because we've had conversations about this before. So I think roughly what he's going to say about this. But I think China is really putting a lot of emphasis on the BRI basket, right? That the PTAs are not fig leaves, but I don't think they're as efficacious and as desirable from the Chinese government side as the BRI part, because the BRI, as Heng is most likely going to say, because I think I know his papers fairly well, the BRI is flexible, and China likes this flexibility, right? And so I think so to go back to Marcia's question, I think China is wanting to go in that direction while still maintaining sort of an impression that it will enter into preferential trade agreements, but only with partners, I think, where it does not matter that much, right? And where it's willing to enter or lose some of the flexibility, whereas in other relations, it just wants to have as much flexibility and exercise power, frankly, as it wants. It doesn't have to be hard power, but it can be soft power. And I think we see that most, certainly with respect to certain standards, right? So if you look at digital currencies, where Heng is the expert in this room and many others, I think there is a potential for China sort of having a permanent X-ray capability of supply chains. When you look at global currencies and blockchain technologies overall. And so I think there's, and you see that most often in BRI documents included. So let me leave that there, and Marcia, happy to engage further on this later on.
Thank you, Markus. Just a quick point. We did talk about this, Markus, and just a question that I was going to pose just for you to talk about in a minute, and then we have to move to Heng. Just to follow on Marcia's question, would it be conceivable in your framework, in your thinking, that the BRI is the flexible arrangement that China now seems to prefer, alongside in parallel with various legally binding agreements? Because we do know there's no overarching BRI treaty, but you have China signing distinct treaties with many of the BRI partners, including in Southeast Asia, including in Central Asia, and so on. So would you be able to conceive in your model that this could be a companion to the FTAs, or the agreements would be a companion to the BRI's flexible approach, providing the legal infrastructure?
Yeah, so if you had, well, you had a look at the draft paper, right? And in the draft paper, I actually go into this in quite some detail. And some of these elements, or some of the elements are from the preferential trade agreements, right? But if you look at the fairly specific, and the problem is that China's stable, if you will, of PTAs is relatively small, right? And again, I don't think as efficacious, and I'm not going to use Australia as a prime example, but I don't think that the Australia-China FTA at this point has much salience any longer, right? And so then it gets replaced with something else. So my own take is, yes, the PTAs have importance, but I don't think they're being extended to players where it really, really matters in the end. But rather this flexible this flexible arrangement that the BRI represents is the preferred method of having economic relations with many of its partners, right? And there you see, if you go through these 5 elements that you also saw on the slide, it just provides a lot of flexibility, leniency, and not being tied down, right? The Goliath does not seem to want to be tied down in some ways, and that's understandable. It's perfectly understandable. Almost every hegemon does that. Okay,
thank you very much, Markus, for your thoughts. So we can come back with further questions later if people have any. But in the meantime, we're going to move forward to our final panelist, who is Professor Heng Wang. He's co-director of the Herbert Smith Freehills China International Business and Economic Law Center at the University of New South Wales. His scholarship evolves to explore the future of international economic development, often from the Chinese and regional perspectives. And as Markus mentioned a moment ago, one of his pet areas that he's looking at right now are central bank digital currency issues, which China is very active in. So Heng is going to talk to us a very intriguing topic: China's approach to international economic governance, selective reshaping. So could you enlighten us, Heng, please?
Well, thank you very much, Locknie. It's been a great honor to be joining this panel, and also I benefit a lot from the excellent points by the previous speakers. And also, I just want to, in my slides, I just want to show that the question about what is the China's approach to international economic governance. So particularly, what's the trend? And also, thank you, Markus, and also for what is the trend and also what is the future. So I would like to start with the first slide, which is about what is the trend of that. So what I would like to argue that, if we look at what China has been done in the past, it's been a kind of downloading. So, the typical example, as mentioned at the very beginning by Locknie, that China joined the WTO over about 2 decades ago, was kind of downloading external rules from the WTO, which are dominated or designed by Western economies, and now apparently shifting to uploading. So the previous WTO downloading wise, people can, as Professor Peterman Porter says, it's kind of selective adaptation. Now the shift to uploading, like Markus and as mentioned in his excellent point, presentation is about China trying to, in my view, upload the China style practices and standards to our international level. And also, since the US was in a previous standard setting, now China trying to uploading that, I think that helps explain why we have seen so many tensions between US and China, which we are likely to continue, because there are tension between new standards and old standards, downloading, uploading. And also some examples, Markus mentioned about Belt and Road Initiative. Yes, I fully agree with that in terms of the unique approach China taken. Primary agreements, flexible MOUs with there are currently over 200 ones with low legalization and focus on projects, and also with maximized flexibility, as you see if interested in one of my paper showing the slides. And also China work with secondary agreements, which are project agreements, which are binding. So it's quite different from the Western style, like the free trade agreements, which you set very stringent rules. What I'd like to focus on today is about central bank digital currency, because I think this is a crucial area which has been largely ignored or underexplored in our research. China is about to be the first major economy to issue digital fiat currency, which I argue will be a game changer, because China doing a lot on BRI investment. China is strong in trade, but China is still weak in finance. RMB is not internationally accepted, widely used currency. And also central bank digital currency like digital yuan, China is actively planning from last year. They also carry huge data. It harvests data, and they give you the opportunity. Data is king. You can process that. So they like to, what I argue that a parallel international financial order. One is the US dollar dominant one. The second one, like China style central bank digital currency. Particularly digital yuan, which China can promote along the BRI. There already reports that China promotes technical standards along the BRI. So that's the first slide. If I can move on to the second slide, in the first slides I mentioned about paradigm shift, which I'm arguing, China shifting from selective adaptation, downloading to uploading, which I call selective reshaping. China trying to reshape in area which China has advantage, like central bank digital currency. They're not because China is random choose that, because China is already a leader in fintech and is a cashless society, one of the largest in the world. The second question I want to ask analyze is that how to understand the influencing factors if looking at the future of China's IEO practice. I think there are several ones which people already argue that in selective adaptation, one is a perception, but I think that's in the China's current selective reshaping. It's more about conception. China have to tell China story, promote the BRI, and China is the first major economy to issue CBDC, central bank digital currency. So they have to conceive that, from understanding to conceive. Secondly, factor is about complementarity. In the past, it was being complementarity between, domestic priority vis-a-vis external norms. But now the complementarity shift to how China will be able to use new rules, new practice to echo China's preferences, to reflect China's preferences. And the third factor, which is legitimacy. In the past, WTO era, it's more about domestic legitimacy, how WTO rules shall be accepted in China. But now to more international in legitimacy, how central bank digital currency of China will be useful, should be accepted by the world. Let's go briefly to one of them. I just want to see the influencing factor of them are different from the context of selective adaptation. The first one is the perception conception. I think that's one China does not start from scratch. I just give one example all through the CBDC, central bank digital currency. China actually mimic the manner in which the fiat currency is issued. China uses a two-tier system, and also China learned from digital currencies using fintech, including blockchain, and also that's about perception. You try to what I perceive existing rules, institutions, and also you try to conceive, try to balance and take advantage of the first mover, and also try to pilot in China and get the idea how they operate. So and China in this way can leverage the advantage in fintech and also in current digital currency experience and try to conceive them in a way which is in China's favor. So that's the reason why you see that China does not really stick to blockchain, but use blockchain in a way to verify transactions regarding CBDC. The second aspect, complementarity. I mentioned that in the past, for WTO era, it's about domestic and international rules, how they fit with each other, how their priority fit with each other. But here, complementarity in CBDC is where you see China try to increase their role in international governance, being from trading power, now want to be a monetary power. And also to expand finance and trade and investment, because even in BRI, currently a lot of transactions are dominated, in the US dollar. And they're trying to promote China CBDC, along the BRI because China's advantage, negotiation advantage in that regard. And thirdly, the China's preference under complementarity and the complementarity between China's preference and new rules, China want to respond to external dynamics. For example, US dollar, it's been dominant position and there's US-China tension. And if China can develop CBDC, which is widely used, due to network effects, it can reduce the reliance on US dollar. So for example, China's trade with another country, they can have a direct link instead of going to intermediary currency like US dollar. And also the preference includes to strengthen China's role, particularly the government role, because by central bank digital currency, China are able to strengthen the role of the government. Because in the past, China's WeChat Pay, Alipay, they are dominated by private entities. CBDC, regain the control of the government in this economy. And finally, the legitimacy. I mentioned earlier that in the past, in WTO era, it's about domestic legitimacy, but now it's more about international legitimacy. I don't have time to go domestic legitimacy, but I just want to see for CBDC, for example, China arguing for digital transformation, fight against financial, crimes, and know your customers and so on and so forth. And international legitimacy, China argues that, it's good for sovereignty, monetary sovereignty, and also US dollar has been dominant, and the abuse of US dollar dominance by the US government and in the using of sanctions. So it's time for RMB internationalization. So obviously there are tensions because on one hand, China want to upload China's CBDC. Another side, US thinks that their US dollar will be challenged, and also they may degrade the efficacy of the US sanctions and so on and so forth. And so there are tensions in that regard. And also other factors are including also institutional capacity, because those kind of constraint. I don't have time to explain every factor, but I'm happy to chat more about that. And then the final point is that what does it mean, selective reshaping for the world in the future? And also including the influencing factors, what's the implication for that? I would say that there are intended and unintended effects. For intended ones, take example of the current CBDC, that I think that's being like to have a parallel international economic order. Financial area, the CBDC enable China to explore a possibility of an international payment system parallel to US-led ones, because they have a direct transaction, between the parties. Ideally, in China's view, avoiding US dollar. But we'll see whether it'll be successful, because people may have concern about privacy and data loss of that. And also China will be able to get a lot of data, as in the era where we see data as a king. And also they may enable China to ease capital control, because China are able to tracking where the money come from and goes, So there are a lot of impacts, and it will be game changer, because once you use the currency, it is not only a currency, also have data behind it, and also have network effects. But they also have unintended effects, like cyber risks, and so on and so forth, and also the issue about where's the potential tension and confusion and the fragmentation in international order. So to conclude, I will see that we're seeing a more more tensions or challenges in international economic governance in the era where you see both pre-existing rules, but also new rules China trying to upload and which shifting from traditional trade and investment to area like finance, and also from traditional economic activities to era of data, and in the era where data is the king, and that involves also possible future standard setting and affect everyone, because at least in China, because fiat currency means that you have to take it, and that including foreign business operating in China, and also other businesses engaging with China, and all Chinese tourists going to other countries, or people visiting China in Beijing Winter Olympics, where CBDC will be promoted. So I will end here, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Heng. I think, Markus, you have control of the screen. Yes, thank you. Thanks very much, Heng. That was very interesting. I have some questions, but I also see that there are some follow-up questions from the audience for you. I see that there are 4 questions, if I'm not wrong. The first 2 seem to be clarification questions from Marsha. Doesn't selective adaptation, one of the first concepts that you mentioned in your paper and in your presentation, doesn't it refer to internal adaptation of international norms? Is there a mechanism that this happens in the other direction? And the second clarification question that I see is the mechanism you refer to as influencing factors. So maybe we can take these 2 first, because they're sort of what I see as clarifications. Okay?
Yeah. Thank you, Locknie, and also thank you, Marcia, for the question. So I think yes. I think the selective adaptation means China adapt WTO rules to Chinese context. That's the reason why and how they happen through the domestic law and also through the practice and also the issue is that people have different view. China thinks that China follows the rule very correctly, and another country may see that's not the case. They bring the case against China to WTO, or people may argue it's been paper compliance. Yes, as mentioned by Tim Webster, there are a famous article in that regard. And secondly, you mentioned about is this mechanism I refer to as the influencing factors. What I try to say is that actually China trying to use I just try to explore what are the influencing factors behind China's practice. So these are the factors which I had done in the past. That is about perception and also concept, perception, complementarity, and legitimacy. What I argue is that these are the old factors in the selective adaptation era, but now in the selective reshaping era, they have totally different meaning. And also you have seen new factors like conception. China is not only perceive rules or practice or external ones, and increasingly conceive new rules and practice, ranging from BRI, but also more recently to the digital currency, CBDC. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm seeing that there are questions for the other panelists as well, and there are still some questions for Heng. Maybe we can come back to the remaining questions for Heng. I will now go back to a little higher up in the public chat box. Yuka has raised a question to Liz. If you've seen the question, Liz, the US, Japan, and others are reviewing critical mineral supply chains and trying to reduce dependence on China. Would this change the rules of the game? How? Would you like to address that, Liz?
Thank you very much. Sorry, my voice is giving out a little bit. I do think that changes, that sort of strategy does change things. I know Australia is very keen on becoming an alternative critical mineral supplier, and it's led to a kind of resurgence of things like rare earth and lithium mining within Australia, and has seen a lot of increased investment in those kinds of things. And I think that we're likely, in response to what's been happening recently between Australia and China, we're going to see Australia seeking to diversify its markets for many exports in different respects. And many Australian, not just sort of from a governmental perspective and kind of trying to come up with things like strategies for critical minerals, but I think simply individual exporters and producers and some of the big grain entities and these kinds of bodies are going to be looking to have a more diversified market for their products. That being said, I think the way that China is strategically and efficiently targeting these measures, they're picking sectors where certainly, at least when the measures first come into effect, they have a very significant share of Australia's export market. So, for example, the barley anti-dumping duties and countervailing duties, 70% of Australia's export barley went to China. So that was a sort of huge market for Australia, and it wasn't easy for the barley industry to sort of find alternative markets for that product in a quick fashion. So I think that while things like the critical minerals supply chain strategy will help to change and diversify markets in the future, and that's something I expect Australia will be pursuing in many different areas, I think there's still this potential for China to be efficiently targeting these kinds of measures, because I think given they're our largest export partner in so many different minerals and agricultural commodities, there will still be individual sectors they can target. Although we've also seen some of the sectors recover through grey trade. So live lobsters was one of the sectors that was subject to trade restrictions by China. And we're now seeing those lobsters, a lot of them entering the Chinese mainland market via Hong Kong in a sort of grey trade kind of arrangement. So the Australian exporters are finding alternative markets. I think that's going to keep happening, but I still think there's probably plenty of potential sectors that China could continue to efficiently and strategically target.
I just want to check, Manu, do you have a take of it from the Brazilian perspective where you are?
Sorry, could you repeat that question, please?
The question that's being asked of Liz, that's in the box about the critical minerals in supply chains. Is there an interest in Brazil? Because I'm imagining that there are minerals that are coming out of Brazil as well, not just Australia.
Yeah,
we have no minerals as well. Sorry.
So, there has been. I mean, so there's something called niobium, which is a specific mineral used in the production of, I believe, iron ore or steel rather, which was used in the campaign of the current president, and he sort of promised that he'd revive that industry and it would be a challenge. And so he resisted Chinese takeovers of companies involved in that sector. But post elections, that sort of fizzled out. Yeah, I mean that's a sort of adaptation of that one particular sector. But beyond that, I mean, it's the concern in the mineral sector for Brazil has been mostly about going beyond just being an extractive export industry and moving up the value chain.
I think we will go to the question which is right at the end for Markus next. It's a pretty long question, so I think everyone can see it there. Markus, if you want to pick up on that, please.
Sure. So Enrique asked, what I've seen it right away, and I've been thinking about it since, right? This question of whether there's a difference between PTAs and the BRI, and whether the latter is leaving more room for state actors to manage economic relations. Been thinking about this, and Enrique, I think you're putting your finger on it to a certain degree, that the BRI doesn't, it's not, from my perspective, it's not formally doing this, but informally doing it, right? That the government can shape much more, also internally what is going on, but clearly externally, because it leaves so much room for political maneuvering. And if you then add to that the lack of legal sort of guardrails, and I mean, I should probably explain that. I look at law as a guardrail or a hedge against the powerful, right? And if you try to get outside of the law, and I think the BRI really tries to do exactly that by not having dispute settlement in a formalized fashion, but rather on a political level. If you look at a number of BRI arrangements, then I think that's probably right, that the BRI leaves more political room for maneuver, and therefore for state actors in shaping the relationship between not only country to country, but also between certainly the Chinese players, but also other players outside, right? Whether that be governments or that be private players on the other side. And I think I want to think more about this, and maybe I'll try to reach out to you. I think we're connected on Twitter as well. So I want to think more about that.
With Markus one more time. I think there's one question from Michelle.
Let me just read this. I'm sorry.
Sure, certainly. And after that, we'll return to Heng with the other two questions that were in the box earlier.
So I don't think that you have cases as such, right? So I'm looking at situations. The idea for creating the model was actually not to be Asia specific, right? But rather, I was thinking, and I'm hoping to get to that at some point, to look at other preferential trade agreements, say the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, and look at how it fits into that model. Because I do think that the model has some value. Otherwise, maybe it doesn't, and we'll see whether it stands the test of time. But I do think that we can learn something from looking at these 5 elements and seeing to what extent members of these agreements are willing to integrate closely with one another, not on European terms, because I just think the European model is sui generis enough that it's not valuable for other areas, at least not yet, and I don't think for the foreseeable future. But I do think that if we go down these 5 elements, we can actually learn something. And if you just look at, for example, RCEP, there is a nugget in RCEP that says something about a secretariat, right? That's not the European Commission in the making, but there could be something there. Although I suspect that ASEAN countries are not particularly enthusiastic to have something akin to Brussels coming up, right? So I'd rather want to be thinking of, can the model be applied elsewhere? And I think they do. And the idea was not to say these values or some values are more important than other values, but rather to just empirically look at them, at least empirically to the extent that we lawyers can, look at them and try to gauge some kind of differences in the models. And I think even if you don't agree with the BRI being part of this exercise, and you can see a difference between, say, the CPTPP, which was much more integrative compared to RCEP. And I think that says something about the willingness of countries to either just have a market access agreements, which I think the RCEP really is, and has, in that sense, holds great value for China, or whether it's really sort of trying to set standards like the CPTPP was conceived to be when it was the TPP still. So let me leave it there, and I don't want to take all the time here.
Okay, thank you. I just had 2 more questions, I think, earlier, which were meant for Heng. We'll return to those now, having to do with financial system and the financial institutions such as NDB and the AIIB. If you look at the 2 questions, I believe it's from Marsha, Michelle and Marsha. Please, Heng.
Thank you. Locally, I think also thank you for these 2 great questions. The first one is that, Michelle asking about is it a role for the plurilateral initiatives of China, like the NDB, in reshaping the international financial system, to what extent and how does it play with digital currencies? First of all, I would like to see that, NDB, the New Development Bank or the BRICS Bank, are quite different, in the sense that, it's different, for example, from the AIIB, because China and other countries, I believe, have the same, say in the operation of NDB. So that makes it difficult, to push, China style ones in comparison, because you have other votings by other members, while AIIB, where China has a veto power. So that's relatively different. So that's the reason why we see NDB practice may be different, understood in different way from what the AIIB is doing. And in terms of reshaping international financial order, I think that's maybe AIIB maybe a more obvious example where they may affect the international financial order in terms of the incremental adoption of AIIB standards or practice. There are reports, for example, about the indigenous group where AIIB's practice may not be the same with what happened for other existing multinational development banks. And currently, I didn't see them play with digital currency because it's early stage. But down the track, I think they may happen. And the second question is about parallel order, how they differ from financial order or from AIIB. I think, as mentioned earlier, the parallel order is more about BRI. It's a typical example where China uploads the practice, through MOUs and also project contracts. AIB helps that, by providing funding, and also you see digital currency where it's about change of the currency used in the financial system, and behind it also technology standards, and also data and data ownership, data flow, data regulation. So I would see those parallel order varies according to the context. That's the reason why I say it's being a selective reshaping. China choose the area where China's advantage, and two, the areas they don't really have binding laws, binding rules like strong treaties, like what you see for CBDC. So it's a moving target, and that depends on whether China's practice will be accepted by other countries, and how they'll be affected, and how they'll be received by other countries. So the COVID and the post-COVID era will be interesting to observe on whether China's practice will be widely accepted, and whether the parallel order will emerge. Yeah, I'd like to end here. Thank you
very much. We have about roughly 5 to 10 minutes, roughly. If Markus, if I'm wrong, you can correct me. About 5 minutes. Yeah. So I've got tons of questions. I haven't managed to ask any of them, but as the moderator, I'm going to exercise my prerogative and use the last question to elicit maybe some ideas from all our panelists. As the question that cuts across, the question that I'd like you to maybe share in a minute or two on is what we've talked a lot about activities of China and practices of China and trade agreements, which are outside the big elephant in the room, the World Trade Organization. And a lot of these activities are based on economic diplomacy, MOUs, they're not legally binding arrangements. So in your approach, in your research, in your model, or whatever you are examining, how effective do you think China is being in shaping, in line with the theme, right? In shaping international economic governance? Just a minute or two, your take on that. We can start with Liz.
Thanks, Locknie. So in the research that Manu and I have been looking at, while we've been focused on the kind of bilateral relations between Australia and Brazil, each respectively with China, in Australia's case, at least, the WTO rules have certainly been very relevant. WTO disputes escalating out of some of the trade measures China has imposed in relation to the anti-dumping duties on barley and wine. I think it will be very interesting to see what the outcome of those cases are. And it's also interesting that China has now brought an anti-dumping claim against Australia in relation to railway wheels, stainless steel sinks, and wind towers, I think. So there sort of seems to be a bit of a tit for tat kind of anti-dumping complaint situation going on there that's been brought in the WTO. So it'll be interesting to see whether or not Australia's preference for rules-based and formal and hard law kind of solutions to its relationship with China, how that will play out. And I think we won't really know until we see what comes of these complaints, whether they get adjudicated, and then if there is any finding that either country needs to adjust its measures, whether those findings are complied with.
I'm going to Manu next. Same question.
Yeah, I think if you're speaking of shaping economic governance, there's obviously a legal side of it, but there's a, economic governance in the global order is beyond law, and that's something we've seen here, that there's a certain inadequacy of legal rules, whether hard or soft, to deal with. If you're just specifically talking about economic coercion, in terms of if I just look at the Brazilian case and I say, is there preferences being shaped? I think yes. I mean, even if there are a couple of warning shots being fired, so to speak, then there is a realization that there are certain lines. However, it's important to mention it's a bit tricky in Brazil because the measures, I mean, apart from the Paulo question, the measures against which the shots were fired, so to speak, were highly unpopular. I mean, there's an anti-incumbency status here in Brazil, and I think, more than anything, I think part of the Brazilian population actually welcomed the measures because they were not, in favor of the statements made by the Brazilian president. I mean, if I look at the list sent to Australia with the 14 points, I don't think any of them would actually apply to Brazil in any case. So to what extent Brazil's behavior is being shaped by economic coercion, it's hard to say. I think time will tell. For the time being, I don't think there's much, there's much sort of issues in the way Brazil perceives China. I don't think that's being harmed much, at least not in the short or medium term.
Markus, your thoughts, please.
God, how much time do we have? Let me keep it relatively brief. I think China is doing a couple of different things. One is sort of paying lip service almost to wanting sort of WTO governance to function properly, but at the same time, sort of on the legal side, right? Sort of, we saw this again with a presentation we saw yesterday. We see it in public statements, but at the same time, it's trying to create what almost like an alternative governance model, and I think you can see this in the BRI, but you can also see it elsewhere, and in which it exercises much more political power, right? And I think the WTO, one of its greater benefits, if approached properly, and I would throw the US into that, and not just under Trump as well, that maybe wasn't always done with good faith, is trying to sort of to tie down the Goliaths, right, if you will. And I think China is one, the US is one, the EU to a certain extent is one, but I think has so far played a reasonably good faith, has played in reasonably good faith so far. And I think it's trying to create an alternative sort of model outside of the legal strictures of the WTO or preferential trade agreements, in which it can put its own preferences forward, right? And I think that's worked for a reasonably long time if you look at its relations with lots of African countries. But I'd say it's sort of about almost like 3 years ago now, I think that may have started to shift. And I'm not sure, Locknie, whether you would agree that in Southeast Asia, there's also been a shift that may have been perceptible in that China has squandered some goodwill by trying to impose too much maybe of its own model on and preferences on other players, right? And we don't have to go to the port in Sri Lanka to do that, but I think that there are numerous examples, and I think the goodwill of certain country, or that China has had in the eyes of certain countries, may be getting lost at the moment. Let me just leave it there.
Finally, Heng, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think there are a lot of great points being covered by the panelists. What I would see is COVID. I take example of COVID, of disruptions to China's practice. BRI faced a lot of roadblock, I think, due to the economic slowdown and also the difficulty to move people and goods and services. And also for CBDC, COVID brings more need for efficient payment. So and also there are currency competition that help explain that other countries, speed up their process in exploring CBDC. So at the end of the day, I think that depends on the trust and confidence in the type of governance behind it, and how do you address, challenges like transparency and so on and so forth. So it's remain to be seen, but now it seems, a long way to go. I would like to end here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and nice to end with a positive phrase, trust and governance. For our theme. And so that brings us to the end of our session. We've had a really interesting discussion. Thank you so much for all your preparations, your presentations, and thank you to the audience too for your active participation with your questions. And some of you might want to also contact the panelists with your follow-up questions as suggested earlier. So please do reach out if you want to. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a great evening, day, whatever time it is where you are.